I think going to just share some wonderful things about communication and what all's going on below our feet.
Very good. I'll give a little background first, and then we'll get into the Carbonomics topic. This is where we farm. We're right here in South Central Nebraska. We farm, we've been no-tilling there for about 30 years. We're primarily corn, soybeans, and then a cereal in our rotation. We like to have that cereal in there. Since we started down the cover crop and soil health path, we're growing things like rye and triticale and oats and barley and vetch and sunflowers and buckwheat and things like that now. So we've tried to diversify as much as we can. I like to show this picture because this is what we want our fields to look like. We want them to always be covered. I don't want to see my soil unless I go looking for it. I want to have to scrape back all that residue in order to find it. And I show this, it's not the most picture-perfect stand in the world, but it's not bad, and there's absolutely no exposed ground there. So when we're farming now, oh, thank you, Kim. When we're farming, we've taken the row cleaners off of our planter, and we just plant with the double disc openers, and that's all that hits that soil because this is what we want it to look like. We started a cover crop seed business in 2009. About 10 years ago, 11 years now. It's grown really fast. Just to give you an example, and the whole cover crop and soil health industry has grown very quickly. When we started in 2009, we sold enough seed to cover about 1,000 acres. This year, or last year in 2019, we sold enough seed to cover about 900,000 acres. It's grown that fast. Everything that you see here has been built since 2011 in response to how fast this whole industry has grown. So we've had a lot of great things happen. We've had a lot of benefits. One of the things, in addition to being able to come to cool conferences like this and speak to great people, we love to get out and share our knowledge. We were very blessed to be able to be a part of this. Soil Health Institute put out this Living Soil film. If you have not seen this, I would encourage you to go look at it. It's absolutely free. Just go to livingsoilfilm.com and you can watch this. It's about a 60-minute documentary. It features farmers from all across the country, larger farmers like ourselves, Dan DeSutter from Indiana, all the way down to small urban farmers, organic farmers. They did a really good job of taking from all a very good cross-section. The picture on the left there with the air seeder, part of what they wanted to get us doing is that principle of always having a living root out there. They wanted to show us drilling a cover crop in the field at the same time we're harvesting corn. So we said, yeah, sure, come on out and do that. We'd love to have you come. So they sent the crew out. It was a beautiful day in October. I had the hired man go hook up the air seeder. I jumped into the big four-wheel drive tractor and, took off, and, the drone was right up there in the air. And I'm thinking, man, this is great. It's a beautiful day. This could be on TV. I could be a movie star, and just thinking, man, this is going to be really good for exposure. And about the time when you think things are going about as good as they can, that's when the Lord does tend to kind of humble you. Okay, so I did see it happen, and it just took me that long to get stopped because I was excited, man. I was up to road speed already. So just, the Lord has a way of humbling us sometimes. So you have to be just a little bit careful there. I show that because it gives me instant credibility as a farmer, because that's the stuff that happens to real farmers. Everybody's had something like that happen to them, but I think I'm the only one that has it captured on high-definition drone footage. So, as you might expect, it's our #1 most popular video on YouTube, because who doesn't like to see somebody else screw up, right? I want to start out with this quote by Emerson, because it really is applicable to what I want to talk about here today. He says, "As to methods, there may be a million and then some, but the principles are few. And the man who can grasp the principles can successfully select their own methods. The man who tries methods ignoring principles is sure to have trouble." And basically what that means is I'm not here to tell you the methods that you need to use to implement soil health on your farm. I'm going to be talking about the principles. But even if you were to listen to somebody else, like if you were listening to Tom, he showed some of his methods that work well for him. They're not necessarily going to work for you here in California, and vice versa. So look for the principles, because we sold seed to all 50 states this year. These soil health principles work in every state. And they'll work in every country. They'll work anywhere where a plant will grow. The 5 principles of soil health will work. The methods that we need to use to get them to work are going to be different. So what I want to do here today is to try to give you a big picture overview of what's going on in the soil, and I want to do it by comparing it to the economy of a country. It's a little bit different approach to take. It's a little different way of looking at things. But I think what I've found with other people anyway is that it helps them understand it because it puts it in a context that we can all understand. Because if you remember back to your high school or college econ class, there's some basic principles that you have to follow if you're going to have a healthy economy. And these same principles are in play if we want to have a healthy soil. So we're going to go through these 7 principles. We're going to look at how they are happening and functioning in the soil and what that means for these principles of soil health. So first of all, our economy, our soil economy is based on solar energy. We have the sun. If you remember yesterday in my little 17-minute talk, I talked about that. Solar energy is free, it's constant, it's limitless, and we get it every day. We can accumulate it. All we have to do is take advantage of it by planting plants. And so that's the basis of our economy. And then the players in the economy are the plants and the soil. That's pretty obvious, I think, to all of us. But it's the biology. It's all these little animals. And I'm not going to talk about the large animals like cattle. They're very important. I just don't have time to talk about that. But they are very important. What I'm going to talk about today is mostly the biology. So let's start through these principles. The first economic principle is supply. In order to have an economy, you have to have something to sell. You have to produce something. You have to have something that is of value. So in this economy, the plants are producing carbon. That's what plants are bringing to the table within this economy. You have photosynthesis, the most important chemical formula in the world. All of our life is based on it. And it's very simple. It's just CO2 plus H2O. And it will make, with the energy of the sun and the chlorophyll in the plants, it turns that into C6H12O6 and oxygen, O2. Very simple. You would think that everybody should be able to do that, right? But the magic is happening inside this chlorophyll, and the energy is coming from the sun. So this is the basis of this entire economy. It's really the basis of life is that we're taking CO2. Remember, one of my laws of the biodynamics, the Terra biodynamics, is that carbon is not a problem. It's plant food, and that's what you're seeing right here. It's what plants need. Number 2, soil provides the nutrients or the minerals that plants need to grow. If you look at this table, ignore nitrogen because that's not coming from the soil. We'll talk about that later. But all these other ones, potassium and phosphorus and calcium and magnesium and so forth, your soils have these nutrients in them. That's what they're made up of. These are minerals that make up our soils. And your soils have enough of these minerals to grow many, many crops, but plants were never designed to get them directly from the soil. So when we see our plants exhibiting deficiencies of these, that's when we step in and have to put extra fertilizer on. But you'll see how soil can provide these to this economy. The soil is also providing a habitat for roots and biology. It gives the plants a place to grow, a structure to be anchored in, and a home for the biology. And it's also providing water storage, which is exceptionally important, especially as we get into more erratic climates. And we are seeing, and I talk to people all over the country, and almost everybody agrees, yeah, our rainfall events are happening less frequently, but when they do happen, they're more intense. And so when you get 3 or 4 inches of rain, and that's all you're going to get for who knows how long, you darn well better be able to catch it and store it. And if you don't have the soil in the right condition, number 1, you can't get it into the ground, and number 2, you won't be able to hold it. So that's why soil, a very, very important function, is providing water storage. And lastly, on the supply side, the biology, they're supplying nutrients through fixation. We'll look at how that process works. They're supplying it through availability. They're cycling, they're making these nutrients available, but they're also providing very important functions of defense and protection. Again, we'll look at all that in more detail as we go through, but that's what they're supplying, that's what they're providing to the economy. On the demand side, what do each of these things need? Before we talked about what they bring to the table, this is what they need or want. They need nutrients, they need water, they need services. This is what plants need. No surprises there. We all know that. We're farmers. Soil needs carbon. If your soil does not have carbon, it cannot function properly. I showed that picture yesterday of Dave Brandt. He had that really nice dark brown, almost black soil, and his neighbor was a real sickly looking gray. Same exact soil types right across the fence line from each other. One example was a farmer who was farming in such a way that he was putting carbon into his soil. The other one was a farmer farming in such a way that he was extracting carbon out. So soil needs carbon. It also needs to be protected. Soil can do a lot of amazing things. The one thing it cannot do, it cannot protect itself. And if you have bare soil, if it's exposed to the elements, it's only a matter of time before something bad happens. It'll either wash away, it'll blow away, it'll get too hot. There's just nothing good happens when soil is exposed to the elements. So we need to protect the soil. That's part of the demand side that soil has from this economy. And then the biology, they have very simple needs. They're living organisms. They need food and they need a place to live. And if we provide those things for all of these biological organisms in our soil, they will do great things. They will provide many services and they work really, really cheap. In a strong human economy, such as what we're in right now in the United States, the best indicator that you've got a really robust economy is low unemployment rate. And the reason for that is because everybody is involved. Everybody is producing, everybody's consuming. It's a strong, vibrant economy, and it's the same way in our soil. Our soils will be strongest when everybody is involved in doing what they were created to do. And number one, the number one thing that we don't usually have in there is the biology. So when we have the biology, the soil, and the plants all contributing, that's when we have the strongest soils. And this phrase right here, diversity, is very important. Okay, we don't want just one type of plant growing out there. We don't want just one type of biology out there. We want as much diversity as possible. Tom did a great job talking about that earlier this morning about why diversity is so important. We have to have that if our economy is going to be strong. But here's what happens. Here's what happens to so many of us as we farm, and I put myself in this category because we're still trying to figure this out ourselves. If we're going to talk about economics, we have to talk about welfare too. And as farmers, we're probably one of the biggest welfare providers to our plants, because when we externally provide the plant with everything that it needs from the outside, and primarily we're talking about fertility inputs and crop protection inputs, we weaken the economy. Now, a lot of times we have to put these on because the economy is already weak, but we make it even weaker when we do that. So what happens is when we farm in such a way that ignores the biology is no longer doing the job that it was created to do, provide those nutrients, provide those protective services. Now our plants start to suffer. They show signs of deficiency. They show signs of diseases. And so we step in with the jug, we step in with the spray rig, and we have to come in and we have to rescue them. And we can do that. We have done it. We've done it for many years. And we can do it pretty successfully, and we can grow very high yielding crops. The problem is these things aren't free. Okay, the biology works for free. These things don't. And so we can have one of the problems that I talked about yesterday is that we have high yielding crops, but the inputs are so high that there's very little profit left for the farmer. And so in order to have a successful economy, the farmer has to make a profit. And one of the ways to do that, it's not the only way, but one of the ways is to reduce the amount of welfare. I'm not saying that we need to get rid of fertility, we need to get rid of crop protection inputs, but we certainly need to reduce it and get it down as low as we can and still grow the most profitable crops, because it doesn't really matter how much it yields if you're not making any profit. And so that's the whole concept of welfare. We need to look as farmers at how can we wean our fields off of welfare, have that as low as possible. We need to get everybody working the way that it's created to work, and that mostly is the biology. And so on our own farm in Nebraska, we don't have this all figured out. We don't have all the answers, but I think we're at least asking the right questions now. And the right question, in our opinion, is how will this, whatever decision we're making, how will this affect the biology? Because if it's going to negatively affect the biology, I may have to step in with more welfare payments later on in order to offset that. If it's going to help the biology, then I may have some benefits from that down the road. So again, we don't have all the right answers, but I think we're at least asking the right questions. How will that affect the biology? Okay, so that's the supply side, that's the demand side, and how that all interacts. Now currency is extremely important in an economy, because it's the only way that producers and buyers, the consumers and producers, can get together and have very efficient exchanges and transactions. Because we have a currency, I can go to any store and I can purchase something with my currency, whether it be cash or a check or a credit card. It's very efficient to do it. And in our plant economy, our soil economy, we have the perfect currency, and it's carbon. Okay, and that's why this talk is called Carbonomics, but carbon is the currency, and we are generating this currency through photosynthesis. Every time your plant is growing, it's making its own currency. So as a parent or as a kid, you probably either heard or you've said this saying or this phrase, money doesn't grow on trees. Okay, but in this economy, it literally does grow on trees and on corn plants and wheat plants, because the currency is the carbon that we're pulling out of the atmosphere. And if people want to call it a waste product, a toxic product, and they want to pay us to take it out, bring it on, because this is plant food. Okay, this is not a pollutant, this is plant food, and the plants are turning it into C6H12O6, which is glucose, which is a very simple carbohydrate sugar. Now, this is not going to stay in that form, but this carbon right here, this carbon is the currency that drives the whole system. And here's how it works. The plant, through photosynthesis, is leaking carbon out of its root system. I've got a really great picture later on that I'm going to show you of that actually happening, of that carbon leaking out of the root system. So the plant is producing carbon through photosynthesis. It leaks it into the soil system. These guys, this biology, is coming and it's consuming it because it's their food source. It's consuming the carbon that the plant is providing, and in exchange, it's providing these services, sourcing nutrients, delivering nutrients, protecting the plant. Because here's the deal, plants are way smarter than we give them credit for. In fact, I know plants that are way smarter than some people I know, because plants are not going to make a bad investment. If they're leaking that carbon out into the soil system and they're not seeing a return coming from it, guess what? They're going to stop leaking that carbon out into the soil. They're just going to say, well, I'm not getting a return on that investment, I'm going to stop. Okay, as opposed to some of the investments that we make, we continue to throw bad money or good money after bad. So basically, the plant will make more carbon. The experts will tell us that as much as 50% of the carbon that a plant will make through photosynthesis, it's not used to grow the plant roots or the leaves or the seeds or the stems. As much as half the carbon that it produces will be leaked out into the soil system, into the rhizosphere, and this biology will consume it. And when it's leaking that out, it's not taking it away from growing the plant, okay? Because it's not a limited amount. Plants aren't really limited on how much carbon they can pull out of the atmosphere and make. They will make as much as they need to, and plants are almost never limited by photosynthesis. So if there's a lot of biology in the soil, these plants here just simply crank up, they essentially run the factory longer, and they can run it more efficiently, and they will make more carbon, and they'll put it into the soil. So think about it. When you have soil that has no biology in it, so if it's tilled to death and it's just all worn out and there's just no biology there, how much carbon are you getting into the soil through those root exudates? Almost none, because the plant senses there's nothing there to consume it, and it stops putting it into the soil. So when we have this, the liquid carbon root exudates are much more important in building organic matter than the plant material that's decomposing up above. Carbon is essential to all life. Well, you and I are 19% carbon. Carbon can form over 10 million different chemical compounds. It's the most important, but the most overlooked of all plant nutrients. We never talk about a carbon plan for our crops. Maybe we should, but we never talk about it. It's the main food source for soil biology. It normalizes soil pH, so when you have highs or lows, having more carbon in the soil will help buffer that. It increases your cation exchange capacity. It increases the availability of these essential plant nutrients, and it actually reduces the availability of some of these, like sodium and aluminum, that can build up to toxic levels. Carbon can be collected, again, think of it in terms of currency. It can be collected through photosynthesis. It can be spent when it's traded to soil organisms. It can be saved in the form of organic matter, which we'll talk about next, and it's desired by all members of the economy. Currency is only good if everybody wants it. And everybody in this economy wants carbon. It's what drives the whole system. Carbon has different states, just like a currency. It's the gaseous form, CO2. It's liquid form, which is moving up and down through the plant tissue and out into the soil. And then it's solid when it becomes fixed in the body of a microorganism or in that of a plant. And it can change states very quickly. Carbon can go from gas to liquid to solid in literally a matter of minutes. It can go from all of these different states. It's one of the most versatile elements on the planet, and because of that, it's what really drives the system. And so it's the perfect currency that drives our system. Now, when you have excess currency, you can turn that into capital. And capital is our next economic principle. We need capital because we have to have it if we're going to grow, we're going to be stable. It's accumulated, stored, or saved currency. And you cannot get capital unless you have extra currency. Okay, you can't grow your savings account unless you're earning more than what you spend. It's just a principle. And so our soil capital, our soil carbon capital, is our organic matter in our soil. We don't get organic matter in our soil unless we're putting more carbon into the system than what's leaving. We have to have an excess of it before we'll get any organic matter to be fixed. Now, we could spend the rest of the weekend just simply talking about why soil organic matter is important. Here's a whole slide from Jennifer Moore-Kuchera from NRCS talking about all the different important uses and functions and benefits of soil organic matter. I think we just need to all agree that it's very important, and the more of it that we have, the better. And really what it is, when we have high organic matter soils, it's like having a capital-rich economy. Because when you have an economy that's rich in capital, we're very productive, we're stable, we're resilient, and we're efficient. One of the reasons we've been able to grow green cover seed at the rate and the speed that we did, it's not that we had all this money sitting in the bank to build all those buildings, but it was because we could go borrow money at a very reasonable price, pretty cheap money. We had access to capital, which allowed us to do all these things. So now we're productive, we're stable, we're resilient, and we're efficient because we had access to this capital to make it happen. It's the same way in our soils. We have soils that are 4 and 5% organic matter levels. We have some that we've recently taken on that are only 2%. And I guarantee you that 5% soil organic matter, it's always going to be more productive, it's going to be more stable, resilient, and efficient. It's the last fields to show signs of a drought. It's the last fields that will have insect or disease issues. They're just function better when you have organic matter in the soil. Now, you can't increase your savings account unless you're bringing in an excess of cash income. You can't increase your soil organic matter unless you have an excess of soil carbon currency. So back where I'm from, back where Tom farms, corn and soybeans all the time. In a corn-soybean rotation, it is literally impossible to increase your organic matter levels without something else happening. At best, you're going to be break even on carbon because the corn and the soybeans, they're producing enough carbon to grow the crops, but we're hauling so much of it off in the truck, and then a lot of it is volatilizing back to the atmosphere if we do tillage. At best, you can break even. The only way that we can really start to increase that is when we start to bring cover crops into the equation. Cover crops have a lot of important uses. One of the most important is that they're putting carbon into the soil and they're not taking anything away. It's a net carbon sink. And so when we grow these cover crops and we're putting that carbon into the soil, that is when we start to see our organic matter levels start to change. And anybody that's done this will certainly tell you that it's difficult. No-till certainly helps, but it'll only get you so far until you start using some cover crops and getting more of that carbon pumped into the soil. Okay, energy and resources. Our economy subsists on the energy from the sun. It's what drives the photosynthetic process. The sun's energy is what's powering this. And like I said yesterday in one of those laws that I made up, it's just simply that plants are the best way to capture this free energy, okay, that we have available to us on a daily basis. Plants are the best way to capture the energy. We can convert it from solar energy, we convert it to a chemical energy right here, and then this chemical energy can be transferred and translated to other types of energy down the road. So we have to have plants if we're going to capture this energy. Now, you can build solar panels all you want, and that's fine and that's great. but the solar panels that we as farmers can put out are far, far easier to install. They're much, much cheaper. All we have to do is put seeds in the ground, let them come up, these cool little green solar panels flip out, and you start soaking up sunlight. You start turning solar energy into chemical energy, and that's what we actually have to sell. We're capturing solar energy, we're turning it into products that we can sell. A healthy soil economy should not need significant purchased energy inputs. And if you remember from what Dr. Beck talked about, he talked about their goal on the Dakota Lakes Research Farm is to be fossil fuel neutral. I can't remember what his goal was, 10, 15 years, something like that, I think. And I think they will do it. They're well on their way to doing it. But we know that a healthy soil economy doesn't need to have a lot of outside energy because our prairie systems, our soils, particularly in the Midwest, were developed through thousands of years of these tall and short and mixed grass prairies growing with the only energy input coming from the sun. And we grew fantastic soils. So we know that we don't need significant purchased energy inputs. Now, that was not a highly extractive system, okay? That was more of a closed loop. So now when we start exporting products through harvesting, to sell cash crops, we do have to put some energy back in, but not near as much as we should or we are doing. And if you were to look at the energy budget of a farm, ours especially, but everybody's, my guess would be, our number one energy use is not diesel fuel, it's not gasoline, it's not propane, it's not electricity. The number one energy use on any farm is going to be nitrogen fertilizer. And I'll show you why that is here in just a second. And the reason is because carbon is the number one resource that plants need. We're not going to talk about carbon anymore because all the carbon that a plant needs, it can take out of the atmosphere. Nitrogen is number two. Now, look at this pie chart. This is a pie chart of the atmosphere, so this all adds up to 100%. This tiny little sliver at the very top, that's how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. So I don't know how old this graphic is, 0.038, I don't know, the number might be 0.04. Let's just say 0.04% of the atmosphere is CO2, okay? 0.04, not 4%, not 0.4%, but 0.04% is carbon dioxide. You can barely see that little sliver. But yet we can grow 3,000 pound almonds or 300 bushel corn, and it can get all the carbon that it needs from that tiny little slice of the atmosphere, okay? All of this blue space is 78%. That's how much nitrogen is in the atmosphere, okay? There are, and get ready for this number because this is a big number, 30,000 tons. There are 30,000 tons of nitrogen sitting over the top of every acre of farm ground in the world. 30,000 tons of nitrogen over the top of every acre, yet we spend $0 putting carbon onto our soils and our crops. We spend billions of dollars putting nitrogen on. And yet, it's just the inverse of what's in the atmosphere. Well, why is that? Well, there's good news and there's bad news, okay? The good news is that we're not dead, okay? Because atmospheric nitrogen is held as dinitrogen. It's two nitrogen molecules, and they're bonded to each other, and there's actually 3 sets of covalent bonds that hold those together. It's incredibly strong. It's very strong, and it renders it inert. And that's good because if you've ever had a whiff of anhydrous ammonia, what does that do to your insides? It's not good. It's not good. If you're breathing 78% anhydrous, we wouldn't have to worry about anything else because we'd be gone. But the atmospheric nitrogen is inert because it's held as dinitrogen. That's the good news. The bad news is plants can't do anything with it either because it's inert to our lungs, it's inert to the plants. Plants can do nothing to pull those nitrogen molecules apart, and as long as they're bonded to each other, they will bond to nothing else, and they're absolutely worthless to the plant. Because when the plant is pulling in atmosphere to strip out the CO2, it's pulling all this in too. It doesn't have a filter. It's pulling this in. It can do nothing with it. It just goes right back out, just like when we breathe. So good news, bad news, we're not dead. Plants can't use it. So in order to get nitrogen into a form that plants can use, we have to fix it or make it plant available. You have to pull this bond, you have to break this bond, this triple bond has to be broken. You have to separate the nitrogen molecules out, and then you have to combine it with hydrogen or oxygen, and you can make these different forms of nitrogen that plants can actually use. And so back in the 30s and the 40s, The couple scientists, Haber and Bosch, came up with this process to be able to do this, and they built these big factories to be able to, break that nitrogen bond and put that into a form that plants could use. And these big factories were actually built during World War II to break that nitrogen bond and make bombs. Okay? These weren't made for fertilizer. Fertilizer was a byproduct of the bomb making process. And if you remember, I think it was 26 years ago, Timothy McVeigh bombed the federal buildings in Oklahoma, those huge concrete structures, completely obliterated it. What was the bomb that he used? It was a truckload of ammonium nitrate. Okay? It was fertilizer. There's incredible power once you release this N2 molecule, but it takes a lot of energy to do that. And so that's why I said the number one energy use on your farm is not diesel fuel or electricity or propane, it's nitrogen fertilizer, because you're not paying for nitrogen. Good grief, there's 30,000 tons above every acre of your farm. You're not paying for the nitrogen, you're paying for the energy that it takes to break that nitrogen molecule apart and make it available for your plants to use. But guess what? What it takes billions of dollars to do, and all these fancy factories, God created these tiny little bacteria that do the exact same thing on a microscopic level. So these are Rhizobium bacterium. They will form colonies on the roots of legume plants, and they're doing the exact same thing. They will take in atmosphere, they will break that nitrogen bond, they'll combine that nitrogen molecule now with oxygen or hydrogen, and they will put it into a form that the plant can use. Very, very cool. It's unique to legume plants, and every legume plant has a different type of Rhizobium bacteria. But this is why legumes, you don't have to fertilize legumes. But don't ever tell people that, well, I don't have to fertilize the soybeans because they can make their own nitrogen. No, they can't. Plants can do nothing with the atmospheric nitrogen. They have to form these symbiotic relationships with the biology, with the bacteria. And as cool as these bacteria are, they can't subsist, or they can't live off of nitrogen. They have to live off of carbon. So the only way that you will get this to happen is that soybean plant has to be willing to pay for these services through the transfer of liquid carbon to that bacteria, because that's what allows them to grow these huge colonies and produce massive amounts of nitrogen. That would never happen unless the plant is willing to pay for it. Now, it's not limited to just legumes, okay? The good news here too, there are other organisms like Azospirillum, Azotobacter that will do the same thing. They are nitrogen-fixing organisms in the soil. They will pull that dinitrogen molecule apart, and they can put it into a plant-available form. And these guys, they kind of go around and they shop it out to the highest bidder, okay? They're not forming colonies, they're single-celled organisms that are kind of working independently. And it's not limited to legumes, so they can give their nitrogen to a corn plant, or they can give it to a sunflower, any non-legume plant. So if that's the case, then why don't we just dump a whole bunch of these guys out on our cornfields and just let them go to town and not have to fertilize them at all, or our almond orchards and not have to fertilize at all? Well, the reason is that soybeans the Rhizobia bacteria, in particular with legumes, are incredibly powerful. If we were going to produce 70 bushel soybeans, that's going to take approximately 350 pounds of nitrogen to do that. It takes about 5 pounds, it takes about 5 pounds for every bushel of soybeans. Now, how many farmers would grow soybeans if you have to put 350 pounds of nitrogen out there to do it? Well, with the price of soybeans right now, the answer would be nobody would do that. But these guys can produce 350 to 400 pounds of nitrogen literally in about 60 to 75 days. Very, very powerful, very efficient factories of nitrogen production. These guys, because they don't colonize, they're single-celled, independent operators, if you will. If you have a good population of these in your soil, 30 to 50 pounds, okay? Now, am I going to grow 300 bushel corn on 30 to 50 pounds of nitrogen? No, I'm not. But what does 30 to 50 pounds of nitrogen do for a cover crop or for a forage crop? Well, it can make all the difference in the world. It can make all the difference in the world. And this is why you'll see along the roadsides, around the medians of highways and stuff, how often do you see that grass growing in the medians ever look nitrogen deprived? It never does, okay? It never shows signs of nitrogen deficiency. Now, I know we're in California, but I don't think even California highway systems are out there fertilizing your medians at night. It's because you have these organisms living in there, and you have 30 to 50 pounds of nitrogen production a year, and that's all that's required for that system. So I'm not saying that these can completely take the place of nitrogen fertilizers, but if we farm in such a way that allows these things to thrive, especially in our cover crops, in our forage crops, it can make a big difference, and then the nitrogen they produce can be there the next year. That's one of the reasons why when Tom is doing his grazing crops, he's having to put less nitrogen out the next year, because these guys are producing nitrogen to help his grazing crops, and then that's going to be available the next year. But they have to associate with the plant. They have to trade this nitrogen to a plant for carbon, and that's not going to happen if we have excess nitrogen in the soil. At the end of the talk here, I've got some of the soil health resource guides. One of the articles in that soil health resource guide that makes sure everybody gets one, Christine Jones has an article in there. It's called Nitrogen, the Double-Edged Sword. Really, really good article about what synthetic nitrogen does to the soil. Really fascinating. Okay, so we talked about carbon, we talked about nitrogen, now all these other mineral resources. So we got all these other things, calcium and magnesium and iron and manganese and zinc and so forth. These are present in your soils, but plants, God never designed plants to be able to get these minerals directly from the soil. It just does not work that way. They can't do that. So what you have to do to get those minerals out of the soil so that plants can use them is you have to employ lots of tiny little miners to extract these nutrients from the soil. You have to let them pull it out. I love this article. Mycorrhiza fungi run the largest mining operation in the world. This is an article in Scientific America a few years back, and it's talking about mycorrhiza fungi and how they're mining the soil. And this picture right here, this is a highly magnified piece of feldspar. Just think of this as a little tiny grain of sand, okay? And what looks like little tunnels or little mine shafts that are going through here are actually little tunnels or little mine shafts going through there. Those are hollowed out spaces that have been formed by the hyphae of mycorrhiza because they can excrete the right type of chemicals that will literally dissolve solid rock material. It liquefies that rock and it brings it back through the hyphae and it delivers it to the host plant. And as cool as that is, as cool as being able to liquefy solid rock, I mean, that's a pretty good superpower. As cool as that is, they can't eat that. They can't subsist on that. They have to have carbon. So the only way this works is if the plant is willing to purchase those services by giving carbon, by selling the carbon to these organisms to get these nutrients. Here's what it looks like. This is a plant root right here. These little black dots or these circles, those are what's called arbuscles. This is AMF or arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So the arbuscle actually is growing inside the plant root. It's inside the plant root cell, so it can be directly connected to the plant. So here the plant can feed it carbon directly through this root. And then these hyphae go out. They puncture through the cell wall of the root, and they go out and they explore the soil. I've got several other pictures here later on. But this is what's going out and exploring the soil, doing the mining, bringing back all these nutrients that the plant needs. The author of this article, Jennifer Fraser, she says mycorrhiza mine the soils not only for the basic nutrients, but also for the hard-to-come-by ones like zinc, copper, manganese, which plants need for strong immune system health and survival. Oddly enough, she says, many soils are rich in important nutrients, but they're often locked up in a physical form which makes them unavailable to most plants. And she's exactly right. We had a soil health workshop in Nebraska a few years ago. Christine Jones from Australia was there, and she was talking about this. And at this same seminar was Ray Ward. Some of you may have heard of Ward Labs in Nebraska. Ray Ward runs that lab, so he's been a soil scientist all his life, but he also owns some farm ground. So Christine says, Ray, how much phosphorus do you have in your soils? He says, well, 20 parts per million, whatever the Bray or the Olson or the Malick test would say. And she says, no, that's what's available to the plants. How much total phosphorus is in your soils? Now, most of us, we'd have no clue. We'd have no clue how much total phosphorus, but because Ray owns his own soil lab, he'd run those tests. He knew the answer, and I can't even remember what the number was, but he threw it out there. And then she says this. She says, Ray, how many years worth of crops could you grow with that amount of phosphorus? So then he gets his pencil and paper out, and he's kind of scribbling around over here, and he kind of looks up and is like, nah, that can't be right. And so he kind of redoes the calculations, and finally, after a little while, he looks up and he says, I have enough phosphorus in my soils to grow crops for the next 10,000 years. And she says, yeah, you're right. You do. And everybody else in this room does too. There is a massive amount of nutrients in our soils, but they're locked up, just like the author here says, they're locked up in a physical form, which makes them unavailable to most plants. But they're not unavailable to the biology. And so that's when we're farming in such a way where we don't have good biological activity, we don't have access to all that. Our plants can show phosphorus deprivation, even though they're growing in a 10,000 year supply of phosphorus. But mycorrhiza can go out there and get that. Other biology can go out there and get that. More on that here in a little bit. Okay, infrastructure. Infrastructure is the basic equipment and structures that are needed for a country to function properly. And the two most important infrastructures are transportation and communication. And we know these are important because if you go to war with an enemy, one of the first things that you try to do is severely cripple or limit these infrastructures. And so you do this. You'll bomb their bridges, their airfields, their railways, you'd hit their internet towers. I mean, think about what your economy would do if all of a sudden you were cut off from transportation and communication. Okay? It would literally, it cripples a country. It brings it to its knees. It's that important. So as I was putting this talk together and thinking about this, I was thinking about, the United States has one of the strongest economies in the world, and one of the reasons that we have a very strong economy is because we have the federal interstate highway system. Now, this is not all the interstates. I know there's more than this, but this is kind of the initial basic overlay of interstates, and these are big roads, multi-lane roads, and we can move vast amounts of goods and services, from one location to another through the interstates, and that's great. But, I'm living right down here on the Nebraska-Kansas border, so it's 50 miles for me to get up here to Interstate 80. It's about 90 miles for me to get down here to Interstate 70. These interstates do me absolutely no good if I can't get to them. I've got to get to the interstate before it can do me any good. So what really makes it a powerful system is when you overlay the federal highway system with the interstate system. Now, there's not really too many people that live very far away from a good highway that's going to take them to the interstate. And the combination of the two is what makes it powerful. And it's the same thing that's going on with our plants and with our roots. So we've got this plant here. These are very, very famous pictures of mycorrhizal fungi from Myco-Apply, the company. But this plant just has the bare roots. The plant roots are the interstates. Okay, they're the multi-lane, moves large amounts of goods and services. So this can transport a lot of carbon root exudates down, can bring a lot of water and nutrients up this way. Very efficient, very large corridors of transportation. But these are only good for what they're touching. If the materials can't get to the interstate, it does no good. So what really makes the system efficient then is when the roots are supplemented with the mycorrhiza. Again, the mycorrhiza are growing inside the root system, and then they're putting that hyphal network out from there, and it's a web-like fungus web throughout the whole soil. Now it's bringing in nutrients and water from that whole soil system and bringing it to the interstate highway system. So mycorrhiza make the transportation work so much better. Here's another picture of what this looks like. Again, this is a plant root. You can see the little black nodules or the dots here. Those are the arbuscles, and then out through the sidewall of the plant root is the hyphae of that mycorrhiza. That is what goes out into the soil, and it explores it and it brings it in. Phosphorus is one of the hardest things for plants to get out of the soil. It's one of the best things that mycorrhiza do. But mycorrhiza can also bring all these other things in, and in dry times they can actually help supply that plant with water as well. Now, they also help, the earthworms also help a lot. It's not just mycorrhiza that help with transportation. Earthworms are some of the best things for transportation because they'll transport water and oxygen and surface carbon residue. Dr. Beck had some really good statements and pictures there of the earthworms. They were, Monty, was that you talking about when you went there and you had the spade full of soil? The reason that 2 inches of water in 9 minutes and there's no mud is because his soil was just chock full of these earthworm tunnels, and when the water hits that, it just goes straight down. It's a wonderful transportation system. And so earthworms are one of the most important transportation infrastructures that you can have in your soil system, because not only does it help with water, but also with oxygen exchange, because roots will not grow where there's no water, and they will not grow where there's no oxygen. So if you're not getting oxygen or water down into your soil, your rooting depth is going to be exceptionally limited. And then, of course, there's been a lot of talk here this week also about how earthworms can help cycle and move and consume that surface carbon or that residue. And, you know, a lot of people, when they first start no-tilling, they're worried about, well, all this trash is going to build up on top of the soil. What am I going to do with all that? And after a year or two, it's no longer, that's never the issue. The issue is always, where did all my stuff go? Where did all my residue go? You know, 300 bushel corn in the next spring, you start having bare spots because these earthworms are consuming and transporting and moving so much of that down into the soil profile. So that's a transportation infrastructure. Now on the communication side, if you think about it, because we talked about how mycorrhiza can deliver all these different things, everything from phosphorus to boron to iron to water, and some of these things plants only need in very, very small amounts. And if they get too much of it, it would actually kill the plant. So how does the mycorrhiza or the other biology know what the plant needs so it doesn't bring the wrong stuff to actually kill or harm the plant? And the answer to that is that the plants are telling the biology what they need. They're actually, if you will, making a grocery list and putting it out there saying, here's what I want. Who's willing to get this for me in exchange for this carbon? And the way they do that is they do it through different kinds of liquid root exudate. So remember, through photosynthesis, it starts out as glucose, C6H12O6. It does not stay as glucose. That carbon molecule gets stripped off. It gets recombined into many, many, many different chemical compounds. There's fats and there's lipids, there are amino acids, there's flavonoids. All these different types of root exudates are signaling the biology for a different type of product. So the biology knows what the plant wants simply by interpreting the type of liquid root exudate that's being put out there. Here's one of the coolest pictures you'll ever see. This picture was taken by a friend of mine, Jimmy Emmons from Oklahoma. And what this is showing, this is a cereal rye root. This is a cover crop cereal rye root. And this is not mycorrhiza sticking out here. These are just little root hairs coming off the root. But notice all the little droplets of liquid on those root hairs. Okay, see all those little droplets of liquid? That is the liquid carbon that plant, that cover crop is exuding out through its root system to feed the biology. Now the reason that you never see a picture like this, it's not because it doesn't happen, it's because it's exceptionally hard to capture this. Because what happens if I went out and grabbed this cereal rye plant and just pulled it up out of the ground? What happens to all these little root hairs? They just slough right off because they're very, very fragile. Well, if I'm really gentle, I dig it up and I get some water and I do a nice root wash, because you've seen pictures, you know, of big root balls, and that's just gently wash off all the soil. What happens to all these little droplets of liquid when I do that? Well, they wash away with the water. They're water soluble. So it's almost impossible to see a picture like this. The reason that he was able to capture this picture, which, by the way, he took this picture with his iPhone. He had just had a little proscope attachment that he puts on his iPhone, turns it into a pretty cool little microscope. But this cereal rye root was growing sideways through a worm channel. So this part of this rye root was actually not growing in soil at all. It was growing in the airspace through this worm tunnel. And so when he dug up that soil and it, you know, kind of fell apart, or he started breaking it apart, it broke right at this and it exposed this root, which is essentially growing in the air, but yet was still pumping out all this carbon. And so he was able to capture this picture. Now, the really neat thing to think about here is cereal rye. This is a cover crop cereal rye. And a worm tunnel is, what, 1/8 of an inch in diameter probably at the most, because he doesn't have night crawlers down there in Oklahoma. This is just a regular earthworm. So probably 1/8 of an inch of a hole at the most. So what you're seeing here is less than 1/8 of an inch wide. Okay? And if we could count the number of droplets of liquid carbon coming out here, and then multiply that 1/8 of an inch by how many inches of a root system a single rye plant has, which I don't know the answer to that, but it's a lot. One rye has a massive, massive root system. It'll be twice the root system as wheat. And so there is a lot of yards of roots in one rye plant, and then he's probably got 1 million rye plants per acre. So start doing the math of how many droplets of liquid carbon is that one cover crop pumping out into that soil. And it's pumping this out because he had a lot of biology around there that's consuming it. The plant is seeing that it's getting a return on that investment, so it continues to put the liquid carbon exudates out. Now, it wasn't happening right here, but for the whole plant it was. And so think about how much carbon is going into that soil system versus if he had planted this rye plant and it was a barren, tilled soil that, all the biology had been farmed out of, there would be very little of this that would be pumping out into the soil. And Christine Jones says that the liquid carbon that comes from a root this way is 5 times more likely to end up as part of your organic matter than any carbon that comes from the biomass of the plant decomposing. 5 times more likely. So if you really want to grow your organic matter levels, it's not so much what you're growing above the ground, it's what you're doing below the ground, because here's the really cool thing. This rye plant was only about 8 to 10 inches tall. Okay, this was not 4-foot tall rye. This rye was just getting going good. But it doesn't matter how much is growing above. This is what counts, and this is what matters. So even if you only have 45 to 60 days to grow a cover crop, it only gets 8 inches tall, you may think, well, that was a waste of money. Not necessarily, because this is the magic that's making it happen. There's carbohydrates and sugars and proteins and fats and lipids and oils in this. And again, each one of those is signaling the biology to bring something different to the table. Christine Jones goes on to say mycorrhiza fungi can extend quite a distance from plants. They form networks between plants and colonies of soil bacteria, and they can communicate. Plants communicate with each other via the messages sent through these networks. Mycorrhiza are both the highway and the internet of the plant soil world. And this was demonstrated. There's some experiments that go on to talk about how plants can, when their root systems are tied together through mycorrhiza, they can communicate with each other both through the root system and also through volatile organic compounds. There was an article in the Scientist magazine that really does a good job of talking about this. There's some great YouTube videos out there. If you're interested in this, Dr. Jack Schultz from the University of Missouri has some really good information on how plants talk. I think National Geographic has like an hour-long, I think it's on YouTube, I think it's called What Plants Talk About. Really fascinating stuff. But basically what they're finding is plants can communicate through their root system if they're tied together by mycorrhiza, because the roots themselves won't actually physically intersect. They may touch each other, but there's no point of connection. But when you have mycorrhiza, remember that arbuscle grows inside of that plant root, and then the hyphae comes out, and when that hyphae comes across another root, guess what? It can penetrate through that roof and form another arbuscle in there. So one fungus can connect all these different plants. In fact, I've heard them say that the largest living organism on the planet is not the blue whale, it's a fungus somewhere up in the forest of the Pacific Northwest. And they say this one organism, this one fungus, covers hundreds of acres because it's tying everything together, and somehow they've done experiments so they know it's all one organism, but it's literally hundreds of acres large, tying all these things together, and it allows it this network to be able to communicate with each other. And again, just a lot of fascinating information. But in addition to being able to communicate through the root system, these plants can also communicate through what's called volatile organic compounds, which are essentially fragrances or smells that they put off. And so when they're under attack or something, they will emit these compounds that other plants can sense, and so they can start ramping up their defenses, or insects can pick up on that. So if this plant is under attack by aphids, it will emit this smell, if you will, and it's literally calling in an airstrike from the Air Force over here, and they can zero in on that smell of that plant that's under attack, and they can start eating the aphids. And that's a great system, but that only works if you've got some beneficial insects in the area. And again, that's where cover crops can come in, because the cover crops can provide the environment and the habitat for those beneficial insects to live until your cash crops or your main crop needs them to come in and help. Okay, the last section, the last area is defense and protection, because our economy needs to be protected from a lot of things. We've got water, too much or too little, wind, heat, cold, compaction, weeds, insect diseases. All kinds of things threaten our economy as farmers. We have to be protected against all these different things, and there's a number of ways that we can protect ourselves from this. The first line of defense, simply keep the soil covered. I know we've hammered on this a lot of times, but it's so important. Rolf Derpsch, he's kind of one of the godfathers of soil health and no-till in South America. He works in Brazil and Paraguay. I love what he says here. He says, almost all advantages of the no-till system come from the permanent cover of the soil, and only a few come from not tilling the soil. We should always aim at full soil cover. So, in other words, he's saying simply the fact that we're not tilling the soil, that's good, but the real benefit is that we're leaving all that beautiful residue on top of the soil. And unfortunately, if we could figure out a way to till and not lose all of our residue, then that's not nearly as destructive as if we're tilling and we're losing our residue. Because anytime you chop that into pieces or you move it or you disturb it, it's going to break down faster. So number one, keep your soil covered. That's going to be the best way to protect your economy. The second line of defense is this whole concept that we just talked about with plants signaling each other and signaling insects and soil organisms to assist in their defense. I got one more example of this, and this is a really cool experiment done by some students at the University of Delaware. They took this rockcress plant, which is kind of a common house plant, I guess, and they infected this plant with a disease pathogen called Pseudomonas syringae. And when a rockcress plant gets Pseudomonas syringae in it, it'll start to turn the leaves yellow, they eventually turn brown, they eventually turn black, and then they fall off, and a plant with no leaves ends up dying. So this plant is on its way to dying because it got this pathogen, Pseudomonas syringae, in here. So this plant, same plant as this one, they infected this pot with the same pathogen, so there is Pseudomonas syringae in here, but they also added a beneficial bacteria called Bacillus subtilis in this same pot. And it's in a pot, so it's a very controlled experiment. So what happens here is when this plant starts getting attacked by Pseudomonas syringae, that plant figures it out. Hey, I'm under attack here. It starts sending out signals through the liquid root exudates, and it starts saying, hey, I'm under attack. Is there anybody out there that can help? Bacillus subtilis says, yeah, I'm here. What do you need? And you know, basically, this plant here will crank out a huge amount of liquid root exudates to feed the population of Bacillus subtilis. And one thing about bacteria is they can double their population about every 12 minutes on some bacteria. And if you look at the logarithmic increase that can happen, they can take a few bacteria and you can have trillions and trillions of bacteria in a very short period of time, and that's exactly what happened, because this is a magnified root of this plant in this pot right here. This is the root. These are the root hairs, and it looks like it's surrounded and covered by this green slime. That's because it's covered by this green slime. And essentially what this green slime is, they probably added the green color for a fact, but this slime is essentially trillions and trillions of Bacillus subtilis that they just explode their populations, and it forms a protective film around this plant root. And now Pseudomonas syringae cannot penetrate this. It can try, but it can't get to the root system here. So you have a plant growing in the presence of a pathogen, and it's growing perfectly normal, perfectly healthy. And this is what nature is supposed to be like, because almost all plants, all ecosystems have pathogens in them. But there's enough of the good guys that offset the bad guys. There's far more good guys than bad guys. But what happens is when we come in and we take out all of the biology, the bad guys tend to come back faster and come back first. So when we can keep the biology in the system, it's a very powerful thing. A third line of defense is healthy plants produce complex compounds which give natural resistance. This is from a man named John Kemp. I don't know if any of you have ever listened to any of John Kemp stuff. He's a very, very intelligent guy. He's an Amish guy. I think he's got like an 8th grade education, but probably one of the smartest guys around in the soil health movement. Very, very, very intelligent guy. I get to listen to him in Wichita here in a couple of weeks. But he's got this pyramid, plant health pyramid. And what he's showing here is that when plants are just down at this bottom level, they're just doing photosynthesis. Remember what comes from photosynthesis? Glucose, C6H12O6. Very simple, very basic sugar. It's incredibly easy for insects to digest that. And when your plants get stuck at this level down here, guess what? Insects are going to be attacking that plant all the time because they can suck that sap out and they can digest it very well. As your plant gets healthier and healthier and grows more and more, it turns these photosynthates into proteins and then into lipids and then into these what he calls plant secondary metabolites. more and more complex compounds. As these get more complex, guess what? Insects can't digest them. They have very simple digestive systems, and so insects will leave these types of plants alone because they get I assume they get a stomach ache or something, and they go on and look for other plants. So the best way to test how complex are the sugars in your plants, get a Brix meter, start doing Brix testing in your plants, because that will tell you how complex your sugars are. And things that have high Brix levels, high Brix means complex sugars, will rarely have any insects attacking those plants. They just naturally have defenses against it. Number 4 is just symbiotic relationships with other organisms. This is an example of an endophyte fungus from the Noble Research Institute, but basically it's a fungus that lives inside of a plant root. It's different than mycorrhiza. It's completely inside the plant root. This is getting carbon from the plant, and in exchange, it's giving the plant resistance against drought and other types of diseases. And a 5th line of defense is just having lots of diversity, because most things are only going to attack 1 or 2 things, and the rest of it will be protected. So the more diversity you have, the better off you're going to be. So there's the 7 keys to a healthy soil, to a healthy economy. Just real quickly, I've got 8 very quick takeaway points to kind of bring it all together. Economies are intricately interconnected and interdependent, and if you start messing with one part of this economy, you're going to affect the others. And so when we farm in such a way that we mess up the biology, which most of us have done, some of us are still doing to some extent or another, when we mess this up, it's going to have severe effects here, and it's particularly going to show up in sick and unhealthy plants. So what do? We step in with the welfare payment. So number 2, we need to reduce the amount of welfare that we're giving to our economy. We need to get everyone working, especially the biology. And when we can do this, we're not necessarily going to eliminate all of our inputs, but we can certainly reduce them, and we can make a lot more profit when we do that. Number 3, we need to increase our cash flow of carbon currency. When you're only growing 1 or 2 crops and it's a very narrow rotation, like a corn-soybean rotation, we're less than 50% efficient at collecting solar energy and turning that into liquid carbon that can go into our soil and heal and rebuild our soil. So if we really want to increase our cash flow, we need to get cover crops in here. We need to be grazing them. We need to be doing this whole system of where we're capturing solar energy as many days out of the year as we possibly can. Because when we do that, now when we have extra cash flow, we can turn that into our investments, our long-term investments. We can turn that into soil organic matter. And then when we do that, when we are doing all these things to form organic matter, we don't want to come in and do this, because these things are burning off that investment that we just made. So essentially, when we're doing these things when it's not absolutely necessary, we're essentially selling off the investments that we just made, and we wouldn't want to do that. Take advantage of free tiny workers. They manufacture, they mine, they transport, they communicate, they protect, they do all of these valuable services, and they work very, very cheaply. Number 6, build and do not destroy your infrastructure. You'll really see your economy grow. Farm in such a way to encourage earthworms, to encourage your mycorrhiza, because these are the infrastructures that really make it work, transportation and communication. And then once you get those going, again, don't do this when you don't have to, because this is literally declaring war on your soil because you destroy the infrastructure of an enemy. So why would you want to do this unnecessarily if you didn't have to in your soils? Number 7, again, coming back to just protect your economy as soil armor, because if you can't keep your soil covered, all of these other things that you're going to try are not going to be very effective. And number 8, diversity is so very important for a healthy economy. We want lots of plants, lots of roots, and lots of biology in there. Diversity will really make the system work well. So that's Carbonomics. Hopefully it kind of puts the whole soil system in a little bit different light, maybe makes it a little more understandable by comparing it to something that you know. There's my email address. If you have any comments or any questions, we'd be glad to communicate with you. That's a picture of our Soil Health Resource Guide, which we have. This is 64 pages, chock full of really good information. There's articles in here from Dwayne Beck, Gabe Brown, Ray Archuleta, Christine Jones, and others. But take one of these, read it. There's a table of contents of what's in there. Tons of good information. We're getting 40,000 of the new ones printed, and we want to give them all away. So that's our gift to the community. So I appreciate everybody being here. I know I went a little bit over time, so I'll hang around if you've got questions, but thank you very much.